Let's talk about time signatures. Time signature represented by two numbers that are written on a staff. Here I use only single line staff for simplicity, but although it can be written in regular 5-line staff in every clef that we have. So right now, let's talk about the meaning of these numbers. Top number can be any number, let's say 2, and such number will tell us how many beats we have in a measure, which means top number defines the length of a measure, which means right now we know that in order to complete one measure of our notation, we need to have 2 clicks of a metronome. Pretty much, top number tells you how many clicks you need to have in a measure. Now, what can be written on top? Of course, you never use number 1 because number 1, it's only 1 click and measure cannot be 1 click long. So it should be at least 2. I wrote it right here as a minimal amount of clicks you can have. But how many clicks we can have? What's the maximum? In an old-fashioned notation, you cannot have more than 16 beats per measure. But in modern notation, it can go up to 32. So in this case, your top number, which is amount of clicks that you have in a one measure of your musical notation, can be from 2 to 16 if you're doing traditional or classical method, or from 2 to 32 if you're notating modern music. Of course, in modern music, we have such as genres as a prog and etc. that are required complex time signatures that will have large amount of beats. So let's talk about bottom number that is pretty much a mystery for many different people, or is disregarded as something that's not that important. Actually, it's one of the most important numbers because such number will give you an idea of how to count notation of that particular time signature. For example, let's say we have here number 2 at the bottom. Number 2 at the bottom will tell you that in that particular measure, every click of your metronome will be equal to half note, which means right now, number 2 equals half note. Means right now, every beat, and we have 2 beats in such time signature, will be equal to a single half note. In this case, half notes are counted as number, and this is another very important thing for you to understand, that every note value that defined by the bottom number of your time signature will be always counted as a number because it always will be played with a click of your metronome. So from that point, in a 2-2 time signature, every single beat will be equal to a half note because number 2 at the bottom represents half note value. So right now, what if we will decide to write quarter notes in such measure? Quarter notes will not occupy an entire beat because beat equals to something that's twice longer. In this case, quarter notes will be counted as a part of a beat, which means right now 2 quarter notes should be fitted in a click of a metronome. And this is why quarter notes will be counted as a number and also the end of a number. So right now, you see interesting thing that based on the bottom number, you will decide to count your quarter notes sometime as a numbers in certain time signatures, but sometime as numbers and the end of numbers, because right now you need to play 2 quarter notes over 1 click of a metronome. So this time signature of 2-2, also known as a cut time, and represented like that. So in this case, in a traditional or classical music, it's commonly used as a cut time symbol. In modern music, people prefer to notate with using numbers. But in 2-2 time signature, when every beat equals to a half note value, now, if you'll decide to write quarter notes in such time signature, then you will start to count them not always as a numbers, you will count them as a number and the end of a number. So you still can fit 4 quarter notes inside of such measure, but right now, not every quarter note will be played with the click of your metronome. You need to fit 2 quarter notes over 1 click. Now let's talk about another number that can be written at the bottom of a time signature. So let's say right now, right here, for the top number, I would use, let's say, 4. And a bottom number, I would use 4 as well. Again, remember, top number tells you how many clicks of a metronome do we have an entire measure. In this case, we have 4. But right now, bottom number 4 tells us that every click of your metronome will be equal to single quarter note. In this case, how many quarter notes do we have in a measure? 4, because each of them equals to a click of a metronome. Now in such time signature, every quarter note will be played with a click of a metronome, or receives a click. So from that point, what if we'll decide to fill out that measure with more notes? We have notes that are twice shorter than quarters, and they called eighth notes. Means right now, I can insert an eighth note in between every quarter note in order to speed up twice of what is written right here. In this case, you can see that I combined eighth notes in groups of 2 in order to represent much more clear a beat of our metronome. But now, not every note will be played with a click. Now we have notes that are placed in between of the clicks. So from that point, these notes will be played on a count that's called end. So we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So once again, right now we can fit 8 eighth notes in such measure, and they can be written as a groups of 2. Also, it's pretty common to combine them in groups of 4. Again, such combination will give you nothing else as an easier way to count notes, although it's not affect the way you play them. They will sound exactly the same as if they were written separately, or if they grouped in groups of 2, or if they grouped in a group of 4. Of course, depending on musical situation, certain notes will be accented slightly more, but we will talk about that later. Right now, it's clearly just an eighth notes that are fill out an entire measure, and you need to understand that when your bottom number of a time signature equals to a quarter note, right now every single quarter note will be counted as a number, and notes that are shorter will be actually number and another instance of the number or another count, which is in this case will be end. And if you have notes that are longer than quarter note, such notes will occupy several clicks of your metronome. So this is 4/4 time signature, where a quarter note is used as a note that's equal to every click of your metronome. Let's try to look at an example where every beat of our metronome will be equal to an eighth note. So in this case, my top number, let's say I'll make it 6. Which means in such measure we have 6 beats or 6 clicks of a metronome. Bottom number in this case will be 8. It's something we haven't learned yet. What if your bottom number of a time signature is number 8? Number 8 represents an eighth note value. Every click of a metronome equals to a single eighth note. Pay attention. In our time signature, right now every single eighth note is played with a click. And more than that, every single eighth note will be counted as number. So which means that if you have notes that are longer than our eighth notes, like a quarter notes, half notes, they will be counted as multiple numbers or multiple clicks of a metronome. Also, whole note cannot even be fitted in such time signature, in a measure of such time signature. So this is why you may write some quarter and a half notes inside of it, but never whole notes. It's not enough space for it. Also pay attention. When we write our eighth notes as independent ones, it is pretty confusing because now you need to count each of them in order to figure the amount of notes written in a measure. Easier to group notes, but right now we're not going to group them in groups of 2 or 4. We will group notes in a group of 3. It is very common in a 6/8 time signature because it's called compound duple. Don't worry about that term, you would learn it later. But right now, for simplicity of counting such time signature, eighth notes are organized in groups of 3. Again, visually it looks much more symmetrical and simplifies the counting process, which means playing it process as well. Now, some people would say it is look like a triplet, although it's not tuplet. When you have triplet or any other tuplet, quintuplet, sextuplet, septuplet, and etc., that means that over one click of a metronome, you would play irregular subdivision. But here, you have notes that are receiving each click of a metronome, which means every note equals to a beat. Although we're organizing them that particular way only in order to simplify our counting, and later you may learn that also organizing notes that way represent a pulse in such time signature much more clear. But for right now, just memorize, when you have at the bottom of your time signature number 8, that means that every click of your metronome will be equal to a single eighth note, and eighth note will be counted as a number. Let's cover one more number that can be written at the bottom of time signature. And that number will be 16th. But let's start with the top number. So right now, for example, I would use number 4 as a top number. Which means right now, in such time signature, in such measure, I'll have 4 beats in a particular measure of that time signature. I have 4 beats. Now, if at the bottom of my time signature, you have number 16, that means that every click of your metronome is equal to a single 16th note. Pretty short note, right? But right now, such note will be equal to every click of your metronome. Of course, since very old time, such time signatures were used to define or to establish pretty fast tempo in your composition. So right now, I have 4 beats and every beat equals to a 16th note. In this case, in such time signature, I have 4 beats, every beat equal to pretty short 16th note. But right now, it looks slightly confusing because 16th notes are written separately and they have 2 flags and they're pretty complex to look and track. So from that point, it's easier to organize notes. How can we organize notes? We're pretty limited with our options here. Remember, in one measure, you cannot have only one group. If you're organizing notes, it should be 2 or more groups. So in this case, I have only one possibility. I can group 2 16 notes in a group of 2 and another 2 16 notes in another group of 2, which means in entire measure, I have 2 groups of 2 16th notes. Now, it looks much more clear and much more easier to count. Of course, right now, don't forget that every 16th note is not counted as a certain instance of your beat. Actually, every 16th note is equal to a beat, to a click of a metronome. And in order to fill out space in between, you need to start to use notes that we have not learned yet. The notes that are very fast, 30 seconds and 64th. But right now, they will be useful in that particular time signature to establish notes that are placed between clicks of your metronome. So this is a time signature where 16th note equal. This is why how important that bottom number, because bottom number will determine which type of note you would count as a number or as a click of your metronome. So at the bottom, you may have numbers 2, 4, 8, and 16. This is our numbers that can exist right here. And a top number can be any number from 2 to 32. We do it contemporary way. But if you remember, in the traditional or classical music, the minimal amount of beats can be 2, but the maximum can be only 16. But this is why pay attention to both, not only top number that determines amount of beats, but also to a bottom, so you would know how to count properly notes and how to understand much more clear rhythmical group or rhythmical subdivisions or actually rhythmical notation that is placed in a measure of a music that you're playing.